Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lee, and good morning to you all. It's a great honor and a great pleasure for me to be able to come and speak at the Seoul Digital Forum this year. It's a particular pleasure because, as Professor Lee said, my latest book has recently been published in Korean. So I welcome the opportunity to come and speak to you in person about some of the ideas in that book and share with you some of my thoughts. We certainly today live in a world of unprecedented connectivity, even of hyperconnectivity, as the title of this year's forum makes clear. And we can all celebrate, I think, the many benefits we've enjoyed from that connectivity, the ability to find new information very, very quickly, including information that used to be hard or impossible to come by, the ability to connect with one another, not only our friends and our family, but with people from across the world, and share our expressions, share our creations through the various social networks, various websites available to us. What I'd like to look at this morning, however, is the very personal effects of this connectivity, of this constant incoming flow of information, and in particular at the effects on our minds, on the way we think, the way we view the world, the way we interact with each other. Because I think here, some of the implications are not positive, are not purely beneficial. I think there are negative consequences of this new environment, this new technological environment that we've wrapped around ourselves. In many ways, if you think about just the last 5 years or so, the way we interact with technology, the way we interact with computer technology and the internet has changed dramatically. It used to be that a computer was a tool that sat on a desk somewhere, maybe in your office at work, maybe in a room in your home, and you went to it and you used it to do whatever particular task you had to do. Today, as computers have shrunk to the size of laptops and then netbooks and then smartphones and tablets, we carry this technology more and more with us all day long. And it's constantly interacting with us, constantly shaping what we're thinking about, what we're doing, what information we're looking at. And in many ways, I think we've gone from being the master in the technology, the computer being the servant, to a reverse relationship, if you think about your own life. More and more, it seems like the technology is the master, and it's telling us what to do. It's telling us when to look at it, telling us what to pay attention to, and influencing us in a very deep way. I think a deeper way than any technology has up until now. And I've certainly felt that in my own personal life. In fact, it was my personal experiences with computers and the internet that led me to write my latest book, The Shallows. I've been a big user of computers since way back in the mid-1980s when I got my first computer, my Macintosh Plus, had 1 megabyte of RAM. And I've been using computers and online services and the internet intensively since then and been writing about them as well. But a few years ago, I began to notice a change in the way I was thinking. I was finding it harder and harder to concentrate on one thing, to keep my focus on one thing, to pay attention to one thing. Instead, my mind wanted to constantly keep shifting its focus. So for instance, I'd sit down with a book, something that used to come naturally to me. I'd read a paragraph or two or a page or two, and I'd find my mind would be getting nervous. It wanted to check email. It wanted to check Facebook or Twitter. It wanted to do some Googling. It didn't want to stay focused on this one story or this one argument. And I began to think, could it possibly be that the technology I've been using so intensively is shifting the way I think? It's making it harder for me to concentrate, harder for me to pay attention, and it's making me simply crave the incoming new information that has been bombarding us for years and years. And that led me to look back into history, to look at other technologies that we've come to use intensively, and wonder if I could see a pattern. Do these technologies, do these tools actually do influence the way we think? Do they influence the focus of our mind? And what became clear to me very, very quickly is that among all the different tools that human beings use, there's a small but very, very important category of technologies that I call intellectual technologies. And these are all the technologies we use to think with, to find information, to gather information, to store information, to exchange information, to express ourselves. These intellectual technologies, when they become popular, if you look back through human history, I think you can see that they do influence the way people think. They shift often the emphasis of our thinking as individual people and also as a society, and place greater emphasis on some ways of using our mind, but less emphasis on other ways of using our mind. And you can see this throughout history. I went all the way back, for instance, to the map, one of the earliest intellectual technologies, in fact, from prehistory. Maps have been around us so long that we take them for granted. We hardly even think of them as tools. But indeed, they are technologies. Somebody had to invent them. Some ancestor many millennia ago had to invent the map. And if you think about it, before we started using maps, the way we made sense of the world, the way we made sense of places and our position in space was through our senses, purely through our senses. It's what we could see around us, what we could hear maybe. As soon as you introduce this technology of the map, you get a dramatically different way to make sense of space and place. Suddenly, our sensory perception is replaced by this abstract picture of the world around us. And instead of just using our eyes and our ears to figure out where we are and where we are going, we start using this abstract picture. And I think, and if you read the history of map making, what you'll see is this didn't just change the way we navigated space, it changed the way we think in general. As we used maps more intensively, in general, we gained a much more abstract way of thinking. Suddenly, for the first time, we began to pay attention to the hidden patterns that lay behind the world, that lay behind the world we could see and the way we perceived it. And so the map, this intellectual technology, as it spread this way of thinking that focused much more on the abstract and much less on pure sensory perception of space. And over again through history, you can see how these new technologies, these new intellectual technologies, shape our thinking in this way. Think about the mechanical clock. Before the clock came around, our sense of time was as a pure natural flow. When we had the clock, suddenly we divided time up into little tiny, perfectly measurable units, seconds, minutes, hours. And as a result, we got a more scientific way of thinking in general. And it's I think no surprise that after the clock came along, you see an explosion in scientific thinking in the 1500s, in the 1600s, and so forth. We see the same thing with the alphabet, with the book, with television, with all sorts of technologies changing the way we think. What I think you can argue, and what I would argue, is that each of these technologies carries with it what I refer to as an intellectual ethic. In other words, the technology itself rewards certain ways of thinking, but doesn't reward other ways of thinking. And the more we use it, the more we go down the pathways that the technology is encouraging us to go down. So we saw it with the map, we saw it with the clock, and I think that's also what we're seeing with the internet. We have to ask ourselves, as we think about the net, what kinds of thinking is it emphasizing and what kinds of thinking is it de-emphasizing? And the reason this is so important is something that brain scientists, neuroscientists, have discovered over the last few decades. And that is our brains are very quick to adapt to our environment. It used to be believed that the human brain only changed, was only malleable when we were kids, during childhood. So it was thought that by the time you hit the age of 20, say, that was it. You were stuck with whatever neural pathways you'd laid in your mind as a child. It turns out that that's completely wrong. In fact, even as adults, our brains are changing all the time, changing at the cellular level. We're adapting to our environment. And of course, one of the key aspects of our environment, particularly these days, our intellectual environment, is digital media. More and more, the screen forms the environment in which we live, in which our minds participate with the world, interact with the world. These technologies, as a result, are shaping us, shaping not only the habits we have and the habits of mind we have, but as those habits change, they're also changing the structure of our brains. Those cellular neurological structures that support the types of thinking that we practice often and frequently get stronger. Those neural pathways that support the types of thinking that we're not exercising, that we're not using, get weaker. The brain is very efficient at focusing its resources on those ways of thinking that we practice over and over again. So as we think about the internet's intellectual effects, I think it's crucial that we step back and say, what is the internet's intellectual ethic? What kinds of thinking does it reward, on the one hand, and what kind of thinking does it discourage? And what does that mean for the life of our mind, and ultimately the development of ourselves? I don't think it's any mystery to any of us the kinds of thinking that the internet encourages. The internet, more than any other technology up here, that's come along in human history up until now, provides us with an incredibly information-rich environment. So if you look at the various characteristics of the net as a technology, you see all the ways that it supplies us with abundant information, abundant, constant incoming data. First and foremost, and in keeping with the theme of this conference, the internet is a powerful technology of connectivity. Connects us with people, connects us with ideas, connects us with information, almost without boundaries. So before this technology came along, it was hard. We had to work to find information. Today, almost all information is available to us simultaneously. It's all out there all the time. The net is also an incredibly powerful technology of multiplicity, by which I mean it provides information in all different forms. Up until now, different intellectual technologies, different media tended to focus on one form of information. You'd pick up a book when you wanted to look at text. You'd turn on television or go to the movies when you wanted to see moving pictures. You'd go somewhere else when you wanted to see still images. Because of the flexibility of digital technology, all forms of information are collapsing into the web. And hence, whenever we look at a screen, we tend to be bombarded by information in all sorts of forms, multimedia types of forms. The internet also stresses velocity. One of the key characteristics, and one of the reasons we value it so much, is it provides information with incredible speed. So today, there's no gap between you getting information and you reacting to it. It's not like, it wasn't that long ago, somebody would write you a letter. You'd sit down with the letter, you'd read it, you'd think about it for a while, then you'd write a letter in response. It would take days or weeks or even months. That's no longer the case. We're training ourselves to expect information immediately and also to respond immediately. And in fact, if you send a message to someone and they don't respond immediately, you begin to get nervous. What's going on with that person? And this shows how flexible our idea of time is. And finally, and in some ways most importantly, the internet is a technology of incredible interactivity. So it's not like the television or the radio or other types of media technologies in the past. We're constantly not only receiving information, but sending information. And again, this is a very powerful characteristic and something we value and something that leads us to use the technology more and more. But along with the information-rich environment that we've put ourselves into, we're also in an interruption-rich environment. All of the characteristics of the technology that make it so valuable as a source of information also keep us inundated with little bits of information increasingly all day long, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep. We're constantly distracted, constantly juggling different streams of information. When we try to keep our train of thought going, our mobile phone goes off, or a new alert comes through our iPad or comes through our laptop. So you can't distinguish these two parts of the technology: information-rich environment, but also an interruption-rich environment. And what does all this interruption, what does all this distraction do to the way we think? Well, in many ways, if you want a picture of the kind of thinking that the web encourages, the kind of thinking digital media encourages, you can think about video games. When we go online, we're kind of a player in a video game. We're encouraged to keep track of all sorts of information coming at us all at once in many different forms. We're rewarded by the quickness with which we can react to that information, by our ability to hold in our mind all these different things going on a screen or on multiple screens around us. And indeed, if you look at studies of what happens to our minds when we're online or playing video games, you find that there is pretty clear evidence that some ways of thinking are strengthened. And those tend to be the ways of thinking that involve visual types of skills, our ability to keep track of lots of different information on a screen, our ability to react when we see a new piece of information. All these skills are getting stronger. And that's the good news. That's what the web, the digital media in general, that's the kind of thinking it's emphasizing, rewarding, and strengthening. But there's a whole other area of human thought that the web is not encouraging. In fact, I'd say it's actively discouraging. And that's the kind of thought that for 100 years has been symbolized by Rodin's great sculpture, The Thinker. The type of thought that requires us not to take in information constantly, but to screen out information, to think deeply and attentively about one thing. And this is the type of thinking, I would argue, that the web, by discouraging, ends up weakening our intellectual lives. We spend all our time gathering information, but no time focusing on that information we gathered and thinking deeply and creatively about it. And you can look at any kinds of studies of the way we use these technologies, and you see evidence that all we tend to do is emphasize gathering information as quickly as possible. There have been lots of studies of how we read online, for instance. And what it shows is we tend to read in what's called an F pattern. Which means that when you get a new screen of information, you kind of glance across the first couple of lines, then your eyes drift down, and you glance about halfway across the next line, and then your eyes kind of just drift down the edge of the page. And there have been lots of studies with eye tracking gear that shows you how this pattern plays out. On the screens you see, the red or orange areas are places of focus. The yellow areas are places of light focus, and the blue are weak focus. So what we're doing is we're trying to read as quickly as possible, get information as quickly as possible, then we click on a link and go somewhere else. And you see that as well in studies of email. People glance at their email 30 or 40 times an hour. You see it in SMS text messaging. All of these technologies we tend to want to use as quickly as possible and then go on to the next thing. Now, why is this important? Why should we worry about this? Well, as it turns out, this constant influx of information, this constant distractedness, is actually running up against a fundamental limitation in our brains. And that's our inability to hold a lot of information in our conscious mind at any given moment. Our memory takes two forms. One form is called working memory, which is a very short-term store. It's basically what are the contents of our consciousness at any given moment as we go through life. This working memory has a very, very small capacity, about a size of a thimble. And hopefully that translates into Korean. A thimble is one of those little things that you put on your finger when you're sewing. Very small capacity. Our long-term memory, in contrast, has a huge capacity, almost unlimited. If working memory is a thimble, long-term memory is kind of a bathtub. And the key to deep thinking is to be able to take information from our short-term working memory and move it over into long-term memory, to constantly fill that bathtub. It's only when we take information, think deeply about it, and move it to our long-term memory that we connect that information with all of our other thoughts and all of our other ideas. And that's the essence, that's the source of deep thinking, of conceptual thinking, of critical thinking. The problem is, today we take in so much information so quickly that we're in a constant state of what psychologists call cognitive overload. Information is coming into and going out of our working memory so quickly that we're not able to move it, at least not in any kind of systematic way, into long-term memory. And as a result, our thoughts end up fragmented. We're very good at gathering information, but very poor at conceptualizing that information, connecting it to all the other things we've learned in our lives. And again, you can see increasingly signs of this in studies that are being done of what happens when people spend a lot of time looking at screens. I'll just, in my book, I cover a lot of these studies. I'll just talk briefly about one of them. It was done at Stanford University in California. It was published in 2009. And the researchers took two groups of people, a group of heavy multitaskers, online multitaskers, and a group of light multitaskers. And they gave them a whole set of cognitive tests. And what they found is the heavy multitaskers did worse on every single test than the light multitaskers. This chart behind me shows one of the tests, which measures how well people are able to distinguish important information from trivial information. And what it shows is that as more things, more stimuli come at a person, the heavy multitasker's ability to realize what is important and what's not important goes down very, very sharply, while the light multitasker maintains that ability. And what the researchers theorize is that as we go through our lives bombarded with information, what begins to matter to us is simply getting new information. We lose our ability to say, this is important, this is unimportant, and all we want, all our brains crave, is new information. As the head of the study, Clifford Nass, said, heavy multitaskers are suckers for irrelevancy. They just crave information. They don't care if it's good, bad, important, or unimportant. One other test that the researchers did tested people's multitasking skills. And incredibly, and this surprised the researchers themselves, incredibly, the heavy multitaskers even did worse on tests of multitasking skill. They were less efficient at switching their attention between tasks, even though they thought they were being incredibly productive and incredibly skillful. Yet heavy multitasking seems to make us even worse at multitasking itself. That same year, 2009, another researcher, a psychologist named Patricia Greenfield, published an article in Science magazine. She's one of the leading developmental psychologists in the US and has been studying media's effects on learning and the mind for decades now. She looked across 50 studies of the effects of different kinds of media on people's thinking. And what she found was this fundamental trade-off. On the one hand, our use of screens, our use of digital media, our use of the web does indeed seem to be giving us new strengths in visual spatial intelligence, in that ability to keep track of lots of things simultaneously. On the other hand, even as we gain this new skill, what seems to be eroding, what seems to be disappearing, is what she referred to as our deeper types of thinking. She gave examples: mindful knowledge acquisition, inductive analysis, critical thinking, imagination, and reflection. All of these ways of thinking suffer the more time we spend online, the more time we spend juggling lots of information, being inundated by information. I think it's very useful to compare the intellectual ethic and the intellectual environment of the internet with a different, older technology, and older technology that increasingly is being displaced, replaced by the internet, and that is the old-fashioned printed book. What happens when you open a book? There's only one thing there. We tend to think of it as a flaw these days, but the great strength of the book as a technology is that there's nothing else going on except the words on the page. The book kind of naturally helps us screen out distractions and interruptions. And I would argue that the book helped train us to be attentive, deep thinkers. It helped train us to pay attention, to focus our attention on one argument or one story, and to extract ourselves from all the disruptions and distractions that come at us all day long. And I think the book, as a result, gave us, in general, a deeper, more attentive mind. That's fundamentally what I think the internet is beginning to steal from us. That ability to pay tight attention to one thing, to move information into our long-term memory and connect it and create this rich store of personal knowledge, personal understanding. For all the connections we get, we're losing the ability to kind of make our own connections inside our mind with all of the information we're gathering. So before I switch over and begin taking your questions, let me just try to summarize what I think the science tells us about the influence of the internet, the influence of digital media. On the one hand, we have to be clear that there are huge benefits to this technology. I mean, I'd be the first to admit that in my own life as a writer and researcher, I can do research much, much faster than was possible before when I had to go out to a library or wait for a book to arrive in the mail. And more than any other technology in the past, the web provides incredible tools for gathering information, for filtering information. It seems, as the studies have shown, to increase a lot of our visual skills, not only the ability to keep track of lots of things going on simultaneously, but also the ability to spot patterns in arrays of information on screen. And this is a very important skill, and I think it's a skill that gets more and more important for all of us all the time. And it also gives us new means of expressing ourselves. A lot of people, before the web came along, weren't able to share their thoughts, whether it's their written thoughts through blogs, whether uploading YouTube videos, uploading photographs, conversing with different people. An incredibly powerful technology for expressiveness, for unlocking each individual's ability to send out their creative works to the world. And finally, I think in many ways, the web is enhancing the efficiency of our problem solving, particularly that kind of problem solving that involves collaboration. Because we can exchange information so quickly, we can get the answers to a lot of well-defined questions very quickly. We can work with other people to solve problems, to come up with new ideas, particularly in business, for instance. But there are also, and I think the time has come for us to pay attention to this, there are also very large costs that go along with those benefits. Some of those costs are very practical. The digital media improves our productivity in some areas, but there's increasing evidence that it decreases our productivity in other areas. When we are multitasking all the time, when we are switching our focus all the time, there's a cost to efficiency and productivity. Because the human mind is incapable, actually, of doing two things simultaneously. So when we talk about multitasking, what we're really talking about is shifting our focus very quickly from task to task. And whenever you do that, your mind suffers what psychologists call switching costs. There's time lost as your brain kind of refocuses. And the more you do that, the less efficient you become. I think there's also growing evidence that this new information environment can undermine some of the deepest sources of creativity. There's evidence, in fact, that the type of creativity that allows you to challenge conventional wisdom, that allows you to go against the grain of social thought. And this is the kind of creativity that underlies lots of the breakthroughs in society. It seems like that creativity requires attentiveness. It requires you to be undistracted and uninterrupted for long periods of time. So as we lose those periods of attentiveness and that ability to be attentive, we're also probably sacrificing some of the major sources of creativity, whether in business or in the arts or in politics or whatever. We're also beginning to sacrifice deep personal knowledge building. The essence of a rich self and a rich intellectual life is making those personal connections in your mind, not relying on the connections out in the web or in technology. So as we fail to move information over to our long-term memory, we also weaken our ability to build personal knowledge. I think on a more theoretical basis, we're losing the ability to engage in contemplative and meditative and reflective thoughts. Increasingly, we're never alone with our thoughts anymore. If you have 2 minutes free, you'll grab your smartphone and do something with it. And that's particularly true of children today. As we give them more and more technologies, we're never encouraging them to learn how to be alone with their thoughts, to learn to be contemplative and reflective and introspective. And finally, I fear that because culture itself is built on the ability of human beings to pay attention, that's where we get great art, great science, other types of great thinking and types of great creativity. As we erode that, we may in the long run erode the sources of cultural richness as well. So let me end with a quotation from the poet T.S. Eliot. And he said this way back in the 1930s, which tells us that the fight against distraction and interruption is something that's been going on for years and years. What he said was, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? This question is more important now than it's ever been. We have to look beyond the simple act of gathering information and have access to information and ask ourselves, how much are we really expanding our own knowledge, personal knowledge, social knowledge, cultural knowledge? Because if we get all of this connectivity, but pay for it with less knowledge, then we'll end up more impoverished, not more enriched by the technology. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your inspiring and thought-provoking speech.
Thank you.
And 지금 제가 진행자된 특권으로 먼저 질문을 하나 드리고요. 그 다음에 청중에서 질문을 받고 다시 제가 질문을 하고 이런 식으로 Q&A 세션을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. Okay, in your presentation, you've talked a lot about the plasticity of our brain. And if our brain is so plastic and also our mental adaptability is so great, then why can't we expect that we will eventually evolve to develop the skills to deal with multitasking and information overload?
Well, on the one hand, I think we do adapt very quickly, and I think we already are adapting. And we're becoming comfortable in this world of information overload. But on the other hand, there are some fundamental aspects of the human brain that are genetically determined, that aren't subject to plasticity. Mm-hmm. And those include the fact, for instance, that our working memory is very small. There's some evidence that you can train yourself and increase the size of your working memory a very slight amount, maybe 9% or so, but that's it. You can't get beyond that. And it used to be thought that people could keep about 7 items in their short-term working memory simultaneously. Now, in fact, scientists think it's only about 2 to 4 pieces of information you can keep in your working memory. So that's one of the fundamental constraints on our thinking that's not going to change. Another is the fact that we can't do 2 things at once. As I was saying, multitask. You can't hold 2 activities in your mind and do them simultaneously. You always have to shift between them, and there's no way to overcome that limitation in our mind. So even as we adapt and become comfortable in this new world, what it's costing us is that ability to pay deep attention. The way we adapt is we lose that ability and we begin to think it's unimportant. You can be online as much as you want, but you're never going to be able to be distracted and attentive at the same time. It's just impossible.
오케이. 자, 다음 청중에서 질문을 받도록 하겠습니다. 질문 있으신 분 손 들어 주시죠.
I'm Hyungju Lee from Inha University as a student. First, it's a very honor to have my time with you in this presentation. So my question is, nowadays social network service such as Facebook, Twitter, and Flickr is getting very popular and very famous among the people. So what do you think about the social network service? Is it beneficial for our deep thinking or not?
I think you're absolutely right that social networks are exploding in popularity and in importance, particularly over the last few years. And obviously the reason we're using these things is because we get a lot of value out of it. They're useful, they're pleasurable, they're diverting, they're fun. But I think what we also see, I would argue, is that the way social networks are built and the way they operate, they actually make the problem of distractedness and interruptions even worse. I mean, if you think about not so long ago, before social networking came along, the basic metaphor for how we displayed information online was the page. You'd go to a web page, and it was interactive and it was multimedia and dynamic, but nevertheless it was this set piece of information, and you could spend time looking at it, perusing it. What social networks increasingly do is replace the page as the metaphor for information delivery with the stream. Facebook and Twitter, they talk about streams of information. And what they're doing is they're bombarding us with these little brief messages, little brief alerts that are very important to us because they often have social significance. They tell us what our friend is doing or someone we admire. And so it's very, very hard to tune those out. We feel there's something very deep and primitive about our desire to know everything going on around us. And I think it's related to the sense when we disconnect that we feel socially isolated, and none of us wants to feel socially isolated. So the shift to social networks, even though it provides many benefits and much enjoyment, nevertheless, by shifting to a delivery mechanism of small, brief, very compelling little bits of information that stream at us all day long, I think it actually makes the problems I've been talking about even worse than they were before.
Okay, so in this fast-paced society, one might argue that it is actually more functional to be able to deal with a large amount of data very quickly and scan through it and make a quick judgment rather than contemplate and concentrate on one thing at a time. So, in other words, the shallow thinking that you have criticized might be the very critical skills that the current society demands from us in everyday functioning. How would you respond?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And in fact, what I'm discussing here might be a long-term trend in how society defines useful thinking. Mm-hmm. We may indeed be moving from a time where what was valued was not only the ability to take in information and exchange information very quickly, but the ability to step back from the flow and think deeply and contemplatively about information. As a society, we may be saying, no, we don't need to do the contemplative, meditative, attentive part. Let's just exchange information. Let's reward people for their ability to solve well-defined problems, to locate information very quickly. So I'm very aware that I might be celebrating a way of thinking that's going out of date. Mm-hmm. I still think it's important though, particularly when you learn about the crucial role that paying attention plays to creativity, to conceptual thinking, to critical thinking, to the development of personal knowledge. It's extremely important that we look clearly at what we might be losing and the long-term effects, not only on us as individuals, but us as a society. And if we decide, fine, we don't care about paying attention anymore, all we care about is fast-paced thinking, at least we should do that knowing exactly what we're going to lose as well as what we're going to gain.
오케이. 그래서 다음 질문 청중에서 예, 저 첫 번째 앉아 계신
I'm Deo Kim. I'm professor of media and IT at United University, and he's my student. And thank you for your emphasis of a balanced attitude to the net. But I think we Koreans are multitasking users, and we have plenty of early adapt-oriented people. On top of that, our Korean economic development mainly comes from IT, broadband, and mobile. So it seems to me that your argument is a little bit opposite to our current situation. So in this situation, what advice could you give to our Koreans?
In many ways, if you look at the incredible strides Korea has made in terms of broadband penetration, now, as you all know, the world leader, there are all sorts of benefits, all sorts of practical benefits that come from that. Commercial benefits, business benefits, and so forth. But I do think that if you allow the technology itself to become the dominant thing in your life, to say that we just need to invest in technology, more technology, we have to push this on our children at an ever younger age because technology is the future, then I think in some subtle ways you may be undermining some of the really critical sources of innovation and creativity that are also important in the long run to have a vibrant economy and a vibrant society. Because I do think that if you want to have the true breakthroughs, you have to allow people the ability to disconnect, to be alone, or to work one-on-one without distractions, or to think by themselves without distractions. And so you have to, my advice to you, and I certainly in no way diminish the incredible technical sophistication of your society. My only advice is that not everything hinges on the efficient use of technology. If you want people to live full lives and to get the most out of their minds and the most out of themselves, you also have to realize that there are times when people should be disconnected, and you shouldn't penalize people for saying, I don't want to be in this flood of information all the time. I want to back away, for at least for some times in my life.
Okay, so let me ask the third question. So you have contrasted the intellectual epic of the internet with that of the book. And you said that, well, the internet is making us dumb and stupid, right? But how about TV? Because TV has long been accused of dumbing down its audience. So in what ways do you think TV is different from the internet? Or to put it differently, which one is worse, TV or the internet? Or are they equally bad, but in different respects?
Well, in one way, technology is kind of making the question go away because these two technologies are converging. There's not going to be any difference between TV and the internet soon. And I should say, I don't think that the internet is making us stupid. I think it's shifting the emphasis of our thought. So it's making us smarter in some ways, but less smart in other ways. I think it's absolutely true that there was lots of criticism of television. There continues to be lots of criticism of television. But I think we shouldn't let that obscure the fact that digital media, the internet, is very different from television. Television, like radio, like other things, typically you use it during part of your waking hours. You'd go home after work or something, you'd watch some television, or you'd wake up in the morning, you'd watch some television, and maybe what you watched was interesting, maybe it was completely stupid, but the fact is it was segregated to one area in our life. The difference with the internet, the difference with the web, is that increasingly it's always there. We carry it around with us in our pocket, we're constantly looking at it, it's constantly interjecting itself upon our thoughts. And so unlike any medium that's come before, the net, I think, is a much more powerful influencer, exerts a much more powerful influence on our thoughts simply because of the intensity with which we use it all day long. So I'm not, ultimately I think if the net is having negative effects, it's going to have much stronger negative effects than television did simply because we use it so much more.
Okay. 자, 청중, 저기 질문 있으시네요. 예.
I totally agree with most or almost all of what you've said, because having spent 38 years in academia at a medical institution, I have watched our libraries deacquisition all of the rare books to our rare books libraries on our other campuses, and no access to them through the medical students. And now the journals are being relegated to the internet as well. And so we're getting abstracts of abstracts in terms of knowledge. And it's creating a generation of physicians that relies on algorithms for their diagnosis rather than a deep philosophical knowledge of the diseases that they're studying. So my question to you is, you're now the president of a university and you can alter all of this. What advice would you give your faculty to get them back on track?
My advice would be to be very careful about discounting the advantages of older technologies, print, other libraries, other things. We're very quick when a new technology comes along to say, oh, we can replace everything that came before with what we have now. And there was a very interesting study done a couple of years ago at the University of Chicago, speaking of the academic consequences, that looked at what happens when academic journals go from being put out in print to being available online. And the assumption was that scholars would expand the scope of their research because they'd be able to search for information much more easily than they could when they had to flip through pages in the library. The study found exactly the opposite. As journals, as articles came online, the scope of citations actually shrank. And the reason, I think, is that everybody goes to the same search engine. In the search engine, because it's based on popularity, begins to lead everybody in the same direction, to a smaller set of sources. And this is one of the great ironies, I think, of the internet. We think of it as opening this huge expanse of information, and then we use popularity-based filtering tools that lead everybody to the same few sources. So even at that level, we can't assume that going from print to digitized information is expanding our horizons. It may, in fact, be shrinking them. And I think it's very dangerous for schools, whether they're universities or elementary schools, to think that that the screen-based technologies allows you to throw out everything that came before.
Okay, perhaps there's only time for the last question. Okay, so now comes this probably the most frequently asked question to you in regard to the presentation that you did. That is, what now? So now that we are very well aware of the risks that we are exposed to by over-relying upon the net and the internet, right? But then what should we do as a society to revert this downward trend?
Well, the first thing to do is recognize that this is no longer just a matter of personal choice or personal discipline. Often you'll hear in regard to technology, oh, it's just a tool, it's how it's used that's important, and people just need to be more disciplined. I think that's a naive way to look at it. I think now the expectation of being constantly connected is being built into our work lives, for instance. If your colleagues and your boss are exchanging messages all day long and into the evening, then you feel compelled to be connected yourself, because otherwise you feel that your career is going to be harmed. And the same thing is happening in our social lives. If all your friends are arranging their lives and arranging their activities through SMS texting or through Facebook or through Twitter, then you feel compelled to also be constantly connected, because if you disconnect, you feel out of touch with your friends. So I think if we think about how can we solve this and how can we protect some of these ways of thinking that we're at risk of losing, I think we have to look at it from a society-wide level. What are the signals that employers are sending to their workers? What are the signals that governments are sending? What are the signals that friends are sending? Are they putting all the pressure and all the rewards on being constantly connected, constantly exchanging information? And if so, maybe they should start thinking about giving some rewards to people who are able to disconnect and to think big thoughts and to be creative without the technology. So it's only by beginning to change the way society looks at technology that we can address the problem.
오케이. 저 이제 이 시간으로 Q&A 세션 마치고요. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you.